Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.
From Buffalo Toronto Public Media, this is What's Next, an hour dedicated to amplifying the voices of marginalized and underrepresented communities across Western New York and Southern Ontario.
We cannot erase, we cannot reform, we cannot make things better if we're uncomfortable having tough conversations,
Absolutely.
if we're uncomfortable talking about race.
What's Next carries forward our mission to engage in meaningful conversations about race, equity, and the shared concerns that deeply affect Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
Don't stop. Make those families part of your life. Their lives are part of yours. Don't stop.
Together, we dive into the real issues, striving for understanding, connection, and change.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
And thank you very much for joining us on What's Next on Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR. My name is Jay Moran. For the next hour, we're going to be talking with Jennifer Rizzo-Choi, Executive Director of the International Institute of Buffalo. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Jay. How are you?
I'm well. It's great to have you back. One of the great things that you have been able to do for this program and the few times that you've been on here is break down some of the really, I guess, conglomerate issues when it comes to immigration, the definitions, the nomenclature of refugees. Very important to separate that, as we have found throughout our time together here. At the same time, it seems recent news events and recent acts from the administration have kind of conglomerated a lot of this in all one big pile. Let's start with just what the International Institute has been doing for many, many years, and that's helping to resettle refugees to this area. What is the status right now of that situation?
So we have not had a new arrival since January 16th. On January 20th, Inauguration Day, the president issued a bunch of executive orders, a lot of which have impacted us and agencies across the country. And one of those was a suspension of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, USRAP, which we were expecting because that happened during the first Trump administration.
Right.
However, on January 24th, 4 days later, one of the executive orders that targeted foreign aid impacted us as well because we received a stop work order from the Secretary of State. Resettlement money that comes in and allows us to do that initial support in the first 90 days actually comes from the State Department. So that fell under the foreign aid stop work order, which was covered extensively because you saw a lot of stuff happening with USAID overseas.
Right.
For us, it meant that the work that we were doing, immediately we had no money for. And we had people who had just arrived. And so, I remember very clearly that day, it was a Friday. I had just signed 20 February rent checks for families that had just come in. The Institute normally through federal funding pays rent, utilities, food costs, bus passes, et cetera, to get people started until we're able to get them into Job Club, get the kids enrolled in school, and get at least some of the family members enrolled in like welfare, Medicaid, et cetera. And so when we got that order, I just thought, we have to still pay rent.
Right.
They're not going to be able to pay it on their own. They arrive with nothing. So, that was an immediate effect because the first time that we had the suspension happen in the first Trump administration, it just suspended future arrivals. It did nothing to address people who had just arrived. So that money still flowed. And so this time around, that suspension impacted 731 refugees who had just arrived in Western New York. Of those, the Institute had, I think, 203 were our clients. But, there's 4 agencies in our community.
When you say you just had arrived, within the last month prior to that?
Since November 1,
okay.
They had just arrived. So they were in that 90-day funded window where we all provide services and, pay for their rent and utilities and all those things until we get them, integrated into their lives in Western New York. So we're very fortunate that the Western New York community stepped in. We ran a collective fundraiser. The 5 organizations as a whole are part of the Refugee Partnership. So that's the Institute, Jericho Road Community Health Center, Journey's End, Catholic Charities, and Jewish Family Services. And the 4 resettlement agencies, the 4 except for Jericho Road, were all in this position where our State Department funds had been cut. And so we were able, through a campaign, to raise, I think it's at like $1.2 million. So it was really amazing. And we very much thank the Western New York community for that. That allowed us to we were all dipping into savings, essentially, to pay for these costs. It's possible at some point we will be ordered to, the government will be ordered to be paying that money back to us.
There's litigation under
There's
this,
litigation on it, and there's judges who have ordered that they're supposed to pay us. But the reality is we have not been paid for any of our federally funded work since January 20th.
Okay. All right. Very good. I just don't want to make sure, like you said, the emergency fund that was developed, it's interesting because, there might be those who think that this region might have a split view when it comes to immigration and such related matters, but yet the community came through on its own, reached into its own pocket.
I think this is a place where people know where they came from, and whether, it's they came recently from a place like Bosnia or Syria, or, you trace back your ancestors and they came from, Italy or Ireland or Poland. I think people realize that everybody here settles here, it becomes home, and they need some help in the beginning. I mean, that's why the Institute was founded back in 1918. It was to help newcomers get settled in. So I'm not surprised that we were supported so wholeheartedly from the community. A lot of local foundations made that first pledge in that really kind of got the, the donation meter going up. But I think this is a very immigrant, hardworking town, and people realize the value of having people come and join our community. And it has contributed to economic growth as well as population growth here in our community.
I'm glad you mentioned the idea of the hardworking immigrant, because one of the things that we have found, and most certainly have found this through discussions with you and other people who are involved in helping with resettlement and immigration issues as well, just that fact that the people who have come to Western New York have found their way into employment and have continued to work from the get-go here. But now, with a lot of the changing status, I guess, for lack of a better term, that's been issued by the federal government, or most certainly confused, I think that's fair enough to say, confused regulations and guidelines, employers, what's their view of hiring somebody who just recently came to this country? What are we seeing now?
So initially, right after inauguration, we were getting calls from employers who've worked with us for years who were worried for their staff. Were worried that they were going to have ICE showing up and conducting a raid. And these are employers who employ refugees, which have a permanent status. Right. And so there was concern that, they would have an unpleasant visit and something could happen to their employees, and they wanted to protect them. Now it has shifted, and we see employers are leery of hiring our clients, or worried about it because they're worried that they would, understandably invest in somebody, train them, and then they may have to leave. And so some of that comes down to confusion. And I'd like to talk a little bit about immigration statuses.
Sure.
So a refugee is somebody who's granted a permanent immigration status in this country. It is not like a temporary thing like a visa, okay?
Right. This is not someone, just to lay out the scenario, somebody who recently showed up at the southern border in the last year or two seeking asylum. This is a totally different program.
Correct. So a refugee is someone who has to show that they have fled their homeland, that they have faced persecution, and they either fear it in the future or they have suffered past persecution on account of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or particular social group that they are in.
Right.
And so that's an adjudication that happens overseas by both the United Nations and then the U.S. The U.S. has a whole screening procedure, and people wait years to then legally immigrate to the United States. And so upon arrival, they're given a refugee status. Refugee status also comes immediately with employment authorization. So you're allowed to work, and that's permanent. And then from there, you proceed forward. You then move toward green card status, legal permanent residency, and eventually, hopefully, citizenship if they're able to speak English and pass the test. So that's a permanent status. With it comes work authorization. Just like if you have legal permanent residency and you have a green card, that has work authorization. But there are other statuses where people may be here temporarily And while that status is active, they have work authorization. But when their status ends or it's revoked, the work authorization disappears. And I'm talking specifically about people who are on parole statuses.
Parole status.
So TPS has been talked about a lot. That's temporary protected status. Those individuals were granted a sort of a special program under the Biden administration. Specifically, it's called CHNV. Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans were able to go on to TPS, and that allowed them work authorization. They were not entitled to public benefits like, food stamps or welfare, but they were allowed to work.
Okay.
That's a temporary status. It's usually like 1 or 2 years. It was a special executive grant. Ukrainians were allowed in under a temporary status called humanitarian parole, as were some Afghans who came in the beginning. The Afghans, largely as a population, have applied for asylum, have sought that legal process, and a lot of them have been granted asylum. When you're granted asylum, you are an asylee, and that's the same as a refugee where you have permanent work authorization, and you can get a green card. But anybody who was on a temporary or humanitarian parole type of program, they're now in a limbo situation because the Trump administration has been revoking some of those parole programs. The CHNV program actually has been revoked, and people are supposed to be leaving before, I think it's April 24th. Although that's now in litigation. But point being, a lot of employers hired people that were CHNV parole, TPS, and they're now realizing those employees may be leaving and they can no longer employ them.
And I wanted the parole status and the program that you just talked about that was suspended. And when we're talking about Venezuelan, people from Venezuela, people from Cuba, these are countries that, and correct me if I'm wrong, or if you can give more context to it, then I'd appreciate it. But countries that American U.S. policy has worked against those current administrations. And I think I thought I heard 8 million people left Venezuela. That might be a number I don't exactly have the grasp of. But the bottom line was, in some ways, it was a result of U.S. foreign policy.
There are definitely those critiques, as people look at the historical conditions in different countries. And if you look at it, the reality is that the United States has always struggled with migration at our southern border. Lots of countries do. Europe also struggles with migration coming up from Africa. Germany struggles with migration from the Middle East, coming in from Turkey in particular. And so, wealthier nations tend to have people that are trying to access their country via a land border, usually, sometimes a water border. And the United States has definitely had a lot of migration that's come up through countries like Venezuela and Colombia, et cetera. And depending on who's in office and the White House, then it becomes how are they going to deal with that population? We see sort of a boomerang that's going on here where the Biden administration tried to control the flow of migrants. At one point, it was about 2 million people a year. That was a huge number that was crossing, and they wanted to seek our asylum system, which is a very arduous, long process because they didn't do refugee processing overseas like resettlement refugees. They have to then go through that processing on U.S. soil, and it could take anywhere from like 2 to 5 years to get an answer. So the Biden administration then worked to create sort of these temporary programs to give them work permits. And now you see a different effect with a new administration coming in and saying, yeah, we're not going to grant that status. And so we're giving notice and you need to depart. And now everything's landing in the courts. So I think some scholars in this area have written and said things like, this is the impact of not really having a consistent diplomatic policy and process with these countries. And this is the spillover effect with the U.S. meddling in foreign countries' affairs.
Jennifer Rizzo-Choi is with us this morning on What's Next, Executive Director of the International Institute of Buffalo. We're getting into the refugee and immigration issues that are most certainly prominent for sure. Let's make sure, though, also, because every time I bring you in here, I want to hear these numbers again because they're mind-boggling. The number of refugees in the world and the projected number to come in the decades ahead.
So there's over 40 million refugees registered with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees worldwide. The UN also estimates that there's over 100 million internally displaced individuals, people who have, like for instance, in a Sudan where they're displaced because there's conflict going on and they've moved within their country. So huge, huge numbers. The UN also is warning about climate refugees, where people's actual land and homeland disappears as it erodes in the coming, next 10 to 20 to 30 years. Out of those millions of numbers I just talked about, the United States has a specific resettlement program that's been set up called USRAP. It's been in place since 1980. We actually just celebrated the 45th anniversary in March of that program, which has been a successful program. And the U.S. has taken in anywhere from like 60,000 to 125,000 people a year. It's a drop in the bucket when you think about it, when you think about the numbers of people that could be coming. And it's a very small number compared to the roughly 2 million people that were estimated to try to cross the border last year who came in seeking asylum and wanting to become refugees, but had to go through that legal process.
Is it fair to say that the current, you just mentioned the numbers, and like you said, it's a drop in the bucket when it comes to the total numbers of refugees in the world. But it's not unfair to say that the U.S. is abdicating any kind of leadership on this issue.
That is a common critique now, especially of our European partners in particular. You have to understand when the refugee process was set up. The world has always had refugees.
Right.
Any time there's been conflict in the world, there have been people who have been displaced and people who have been targeted because of things they cannot change about themselves, the color of their skin, their religion, etc. But the world came to a reckoning in World War II with a huge persecution of a population because of their religion, Jewish refugees. And so coming out of World War II, as I teach my students in class, the international humanitarian protection regime was set up. Our diplomat and designee at that time was Eleanor Roosevelt, one of my personal heroes, who went there and they, laid out the, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we set up and we were a signatory to the 1951 Convention on Refugees. And that's what set up the definition that I've talked about and the process. And each country then that signed, agreed to do things, which include non-refoulement. We will not send somebody back to a homeland where they will be persecuted. That is a commitment that we made, as did other signatories. The United States decided to take it one step further. We created a funding program, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, embedded it in our law with the 1980 Refugee Act, which was passed by Congress and signed by the president. And so we have a designated process to handle people who come in through that waiting process, that vetted, secure process. That's like the 100,000 people a year. And then we set up a framework to allow people who reach our border to seek asylum and ask for the ability to stay. And that's that whole court process, which is the asylum seeking process. But, every country has a different way of handling it. But a lot of these countries today are saying that the U.S., with some of the decisions that we're seeing now under this new administration, is backing off of its international law obligations, its treaty obligations, and its commitment to human rights and international refugee protection.
I put these questions on your plate when I have you here because I know you're not don't seem to have any trouble answering them. So I'll throw this one out there. What happened? What happened since 1980 that has changed this attitude? Again, it wasn't as if the United States was, bringing in a massive, overwhelming amount of refugees to this country. Like you said, you use the word drop in the bucket. And when you really think about the numbers in this world, it was and is, was a drop in the bucket. We can put it in the past tense, at least for the moment. What's happened? What's happened since that time, 1980, or go back to 1951? Is it just short memories? People don't know their history? What do you think?
Oh, it's a lot of things. And I think it's education and the politicization of this topic. The reality is that the refugee resettlement regime is separate from people who attempt to cross the border.
Right.
But, and in fact, this was a program that was championed by Republicans in the 80s. It was a successful program under the Reagan administration and the Bush administration. But immigration has become more of a fraught topic politically in the last 20 years as the United States, as many other countries, have struggled to control migration across their border. And somehow the topic of migrants and asylum seekers got conflated with resettlement refugees, and people aren't always willing to sit down and learn the difference. I mean, that's why I appreciate this format of this show, that we can talk about it and people understand the difference. And I don't want to say one immigrant is better than the other, because there are no bad people. No one human is illegal. It's just a matter of how do you seek the process to find safety and protection. Not everybody is able to flee their homeland and get to a neighboring United Nations camp. The UN doesn't operate everywhere. That's a fact. But I think in recent years, as we've had larger numbers showing up at our border and it becoming a topic and a campaign point in presidential elections, people stop listening to the nuance of the difference and stop realizing that people are going to go where they need safety. I mean, no one is going to stay in a dangerous place if they are going to die and they can't feed their kids and they can't survive. And a big part of this is there's been a failure on behalf of our government in successive administrations, both Democrat and Republican, to really conclusively deal with, in a real way, the migration flow at the southern border. And so I do try, when possible, to talk about the refugee resettlement program and show that it's been successful and that it's completely different than their failures that have happened with migration. If you look at the refugee resettlement program, there was a study done that was a 15-year study that was performed by the U.S. HHS department. It showed that over 15 years of all the money that was invested into resettlement refugees and asylees, people granted status, through agencies like the International Institute and welfare and job training, et cetera, when you take what was invested in versus what they've contributed to our economy, there was $124 billion net benefit.
Wow.
By this population over a 15-year period. And we're talking about, I think it was like roughly 2 million people over the course of, 15 years. So it does work. And if you look historically back, why did America grow and prosper when we had tons of migration in the early 1900s, the Italians, my family, the 1910s, the 1920s. And there was a period of time where about 12 million people came in the first 30 years of the 1900th century, okay? And those were largely Italians, Puerto Ricans, and Irish. And that the America's economy and our industrial strength grew in that time, and it was credited to immigration. So, I mean, we've had benefits and gains. With that does need to be paired processing, national security concerns. I mean, we can't just have a complete open door where everybody walks in, but right. You need to have a rational conversation about your labor flow and your economic needs and how to structure people coming in to contribute to your country.
You mentioned that 15-year study and looking at the net gain, so to speak, net financial gain of refugees coming to the United States. We probably don't have exactly those numbers when it comes to Western New York, but we do know that the population of Buffalo and Erie County has increased for the first time in a couple of generations, if I'm not mistaken. But what would we see? What might we see about in terms of impact here in Buffalo? Let's try to bring it to local a little bit. What could happen moving forward here?
We've had a lot of success, I think, in recent years. The 2020 census was the first time that showed population growth, which was attributed to the foreign-born. 10% of Buffalo is foreign-born, the city population. I think it's almost 8% of Erie County is foreign-born, and roughly 20% of New York State is foreign-born. So, New York is a state that is deriving benefit from having foreign-born individuals and refugees specifically repopulating the region. We were on track with doing resettlement of anywhere between 2,000 and 3,000 people a year between the 4 agencies in Buffalo, and there was a steady progress in that, no matter who was in the White House. So the concern here now is that has been brought to an abrupt halt. The USREP program, as I mentioned, was suspended. back in January. The Trump administration did take it a step forward in end of February, and they terminated the contracts for resettlement, which was against a court order, and the court has now ordered that they resume the contract. So I got notice last week that the contract has been reopened, but that it would immediately go back into suspension. So there doesn't seem to be interest on behalf of the current administration to commit to refugee resettlement as prior administrations had. So I'm not sure what that will mean for Buffalo. I can tell you that for our clients, there's fear. There is family separation that seems to be now indefinite. If you came before your adult children could come or before your parents could come, you're going to continue to be separated. And I think it's hard when you have people you want to integrate successfully into your community when they have these big unresolved questions out there about, is this really my home? Am I really welcome here? Or is this just another place I'm going to get kicked out of?
Going to leave that as our final note before we go to break. We'll come back. We have a lot more to talk about, obviously, here with Jennifer Rizzo-Choi, Executive Director of the International Institute of Buffalo. This is What's Next on Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
Buffalo Toronto Public Media produced a short documentary on creative restorations, which delivers life-saving supplies to combat overdose in Western New York.
Because we're a new agency, what happens sometimes is, a lot of grant funders, they are hesitant to fund you. So we were on the fence with getting the grant before I sent them the video. It was able to show the grant funder what exactly their money was going to go towards. With that grant, that allowed us to secure a home base. Now we have a location where we do community meals, where we provide services right then and there. So I think the importance is you guys were able to really put boots on the ground with us, really show the city in a lens that you don't commonly see. So I think it helps to raise awareness to some of the issues that we have in our city, but also what else left do we have to do as a community to better our community. Please, if you can, fund public media, make sure that they're available because they really put a harder focus on the community and it really gives a better view of what we really need to get done here.
Contact Congress now at protectmypublicmedia.org.
Reports from WBFO's Disabilities Beat provide listeners with essential information about the challenges facing people with disabilities, as well as content that promotes understanding. Listen to WBFO Wednesdays during Morning Edition and All Things Considered.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the BTPM Listen app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@btpm.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
And you're listening to What's Next. My name is Jay Moran. Jennifer Rizzo-Choi is our guest this morning, Executive Director of the International Institute of Buffalo. If you're just joining us, we're getting into a lot of issues. There's a lot to talk about when it comes to immigration, when it comes to refugees. And most certainly a worthwhile conversation here, and hopefully we're getting some important information out there. There's a gentleman from Maryland who now is in El Salvador. He's not supposed to be there. He was taken in one of these wide ice sweeps, I guess, and sent to El Salvador to serve time in a prison. Well, we can get into what those facilities in El Salvador are all about, but that's another story. This gentleman, Mr. Garcia from Maryland, talk about what happened, what you understand happened to him, and what his legal status is.
So, Kilmar Abrego Garcia was someone who was granted withholding of removal in 2019 by an immigration judge. So that's sort of an arcane legal term, but it's on par with asylum. Okay, so let's step back a little bit. We've talked about resettlement refugees and how they get here. When you seek asylum in the United States, you're seeking the same legal protection. You have to show that you're outside of your homeland, have suffered persecution, and fear future persecution if you are returned to your homeland on account of your race, religion, particular social opinion, nationality, or religion. Okay, so you go through that process before an immigration court here in the United States, which is what this man did, apparently in 2019.
Okay.
He was not granted asylum. He was granted withholding of removal. And so that's what that means. It means that they are going to withhold removing him or deporting him to his homeland of El Salvador, because the judge found that while he did not meet all of the criteria for asylum, they believed he was credible and that he would be persecuted if he was removed. And they said, we will, as a nation, we will not remove him. We will not deport him there. So that goes part of those international law commitments I just talked about non-refoulement, not returning someone to a persecutor. So when you're granted withholding of removal, you're not going to move forward in life and get a green card, but you're allowed to stay in this country. You're given work permission, and you're given the assurance of protection. So what is peculiar and upsetting in this case is that somehow between having that grant comes from the federal government. Between that in 2019 and today, he was put on a deportation flight with largely other Venezuelans and was sent to a prison in El Salvador, which is the country he's from, where he was very afraid of being persecuted and killed there. So that has led to a lot of litigation, a lot of news coverage on the topic, and it went up to the Supreme Court last week, and the Supreme Court had said that the federal judge's order at the district court level that he needed to be brought back. And so now we're waiting to see if that is going to happen. And what's concerning in this situation is that it appears that he was placed on a deportation flight, and it was at the word of Homeland Security officials that he did not go before a judge again. And so that's the big part of this is, where is the due process, right? Before you have a decision rendered on your case, you're supposed to be able to have your day in court. His last day in court was in 2019 when he was granted protection. Now, the Trump administration is saying that he's apparently an active member of a gang. And if that is the case, then he should have been brought into a court, presumably a criminal court to start, because that's, an active ongoing crime. And then from there, he would have then had to be put back toward an immigration court for his deportation proceeding if they were going to reopen deportation. Neither of those things happened. And so that's the concern, is that he's been removed to a country off of U.S. soil where U.S. rights and protections no longer exist.
So he was part of... in essence, a large group of people kind of thrown in together in one big pile, and he ends up back in El Salvador.
Right. And there's a large concern in lawyer circles and in immigration lawyer field that there has just been an avoidance of judicial review. A lot of the folks who were put on that flight also apparently were put on that flight under an order from the Alien Enemies Act, which is another very old law going back to the late 1700s, where the Trump administration is saying that they're able to use that law to remove people from the country and, again, not put them through a judicial review process. So those are being litigated in both ways now. There's a bunch of the ACLU and other groups are fighting it and saying we need to have a process here where if someone is accused of something, that they're able to, put a defense out there. I've read things where I've had people say, well, this is too much work on behalf of the, millions of people that the Trump administration wants to deport, to put every single person through an individual review. But that's the framework of our legal foundation. Everyone should have their day in court rather than have somebody just make a summary decision and put them on a plane. The judge in the Maryland man's case is very concerned that the evidence has been quite weak and alleging that he is part of a gang. And the judge says that, that needs to be heard out in court before a decision like that is made. But bringing somebody back from El Salvador is proving to be difficult. At least that's what the Trump administration is saying. I can tell you that in the long history of immigration law, there have been people erroneously deported off many times, including U.S. citizens, and they have been able...
Including U.S. citizens.
Oh, yes. Sometimes U.S. citizens get deported. Sometimes U.S. citizens don't speak English, and Homeland Security doesn't go through the process of checking to make sure that their documents are intact and who they are, who they say they are. So that has happened. And those instances with, the help of lawyers and court proceedings, the person has been brought back. So we need to continue to watch and see, because there is no reason why the Trump administration could not bring this man back. And the court is now requiring daily check-ins and updates to find out what's going on in order to bring him back.
that concept of deportation of U.S. citizens. And I guess maybe, I don't know, not necessarily going to even ask you a question, I'm just saying that seems to have, that could be a chilling precedent as we move forward here in these coming months and years to go. Let's move on to talk about lack of clarity. You mentioned to me before we went on the air a couple of emails that have come in that have lacked clarity in terms of process. Some were false or turned out to be erroneous. Let's talk about a couple of those instances, because this, again, kind of almost falls into what seems to be a pattern of maybe overacting at the federal level and maybe not necessarily paying attention to details, and maybe in some cases not caring about the details.
Well, it's concerning, and whether it's incompetency or just lack of haste. But there have been emails that have gone out that have caused fear for a variety of immigrant populations. There was an email last weekend, so not the one that just happened, but earlier in April, that went to I think roughly 100,000 Ukrainians who were on humanitarian parole, which is a temporary status. The email went out and the first line said, "It is now time for you to leave the United States. You must depart within 7 days." And it, gave them, it essentially was revoking their status and saying, you need to leave right now. And that resulted in emails and calls, panicked to us over the weekend, I'm sure to other lawyers across the country. And then it was announced by the Trump administration that it was a mistaken email that was not meant to go out. And I don't really know why or how that could have gone out. I mean, it makes me wonder if it was in a draft inbox and erroneously someone clicked send, or you have to understand when you apply for immigration benefits in this country, it's all automated now. You have to go through like online portals and it's digitized. Your fingerprints are digitized. So there's a lot of data that's captured in government databases. So I guess presumably they have people keyed into different groups and they can send emails to certain categories of people. So the Ukrainian parole email being revoked was erroneous and has been rescinded. However, we are now getting regular requests from clients that are asking was that just a fire drill? Is that going to happen? They're very worried that their status would be revoked and that they would have to go back to a country that is in the midst of a huge war right now. There was also an email that went out that I saw reports over this past weekend that went to a lot of immigration lawyers, same language, saying your time, it has now come time for you to leave the United States. You need to leave in 7 days. A lot of the people who receive those emails are U.S. citizens, like born in the U.S., practicing.
Well, for example, you're an immigration lawyer.
Yes, and I was born in the United States.
Right.
Yes. I did not receive one of those notices, but I know several colleagues that did. That was also, I assume, a mistaken email. When you represent somebody before immigration court or USCIS, you have to file to put yourself on the case. And so all lawyers' emails and names are in their database as well. So it's probably another erroneous email, but it makes you wonder. These are some pretty broad, big, impacting statements to send out that are going to cause fear. And then, then there's this announcement of, that was a mistake. Actually, that doesn't have to happen. So it just, it makes you wonder what's going on.
Yeah. And just to add to it, we have regular communication here with a member of the local IRS office who has been sending us updates on confusing emails they've been getting about their future in the federal workforce as well. So again, maybe a lack of details, maybe there's another overriding spirit involved in these types of examples for sure. So much to talk about when we get into this, but another element that I wanted to talk about is you also expressed to me that there is maybe a special status exists or emerging when it comes to welcoming a refugee population, and this one is from South Africa. What can you tell me about that?
So this is a new thing that has come out in the last couple of months. So going back to January 20th, when the executive order suspended the U.S. refugee admissions program, which is now being litigated. That also froze all the funding. Okay, so organizations like the International Institute haven't been paid, and we're receiving no new funding, and we've received no new clients in. Essentially, a big part of that process, the State Department side of it, has been shuttered. And the contracts that employed individuals overseas at the RSCs, the Refugee Service Centers, have also been rescinded and closed as well. So individuals no longer work there. There's no pipeline anymore to process people. And that is why it was curious that by executive order, I think last month in March, the Trump administration announced that they were going to prioritize the resettlement of Afrikaners, which is a population in South Africa of individuals who've lost their land rights. So it was a short EO that came out. It said that this population would be prioritized for resettlement, and it left a lot of us in the resettlement industry confused because the apparatus to fund and maintain staff has disappeared due to the lack of funding and the lack of payment. I understand from newspaper reports, there was an article in the New York Times even last week that the U.S. has sent some government officials over to South Africa to screen applicants for this status. They have offices in Pretoria to do it. And there's, I guess, several thousand claims that are being vetted. I'm waiting to hear more. I'm curious about this because, I mean, one of the core pieces of refugee status is you have to be outside of your homeland. The Afrikaner population still lives in South Africa, which is where they say the persecution happened. So it's puzzling what's going on, and we're waiting to see. I do know our national office, that's how we would get our refugees in. They have not been contacted to process that population at all. But I understand that a couple of the national offices have received word that they may be given some refugees to be processed that are part of this Afrikaner group. And I would just point out that if this population is processed, not only can they not do it through the State Department mechanism, they have to put it through HHS funding, but the other populations that were being brought in are entirely stalled. So Sudanese, Syrian, Iraqi, Afghan, Congolese, Eritrean, Burmese, Colombians, all those populations that were coming into Buffalo are still on suspension, but there's talk of bringing in this new population.
We'll most certainly have to keep an eye on that as we move forward here in the coming weeks. I'm going to take one more time out and come back with our final moments with Jennifer Rizzo-Choi, Executive Director of the International Institute of Buffalo. This is What's Next on Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
Our mission at Buffalo Toronto Public Media is to serve our local community. And on WBFO, we do that by keeping you informed. We bring you important perspectives from your neighbors on what's next.
It's cultural heritage tourism. People go and they travel different places to learn about history and lived experiences that only took place in that area. Oftentimes you may have people in certain positions that don't understand the value of cultural heritage tourism.
And we investigate issues in our community, such as racial disparities in traffic stops.
The data breakdown by council district shows that black people are stopped disproportionately to their population in all 9 districts. Lovejoy District leads the pack in terms of those disproportionate stops. Just 37% of the district's population is black, yet black motorists account for almost 70% of stop receipts issued there.
This is public media.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the BTPM Listen app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using whatsnext@btpm.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
And welcome back to What's Next, our final segment with Jennifer Rizzo-Choi, Executive Director of the International Institute of Buffalo. Obviously, we've been deep in some very serious conversation here, but I did want to take a moment just to talk about something that we had a chance to talk with your colleague Gabe DeMeo about this last year. The Community World Trivia Competition it'll become a bit of a staple for the International Institute, hasn't it?
It has. It's a fun event. People really love it. It's a pub quiz type of format, but based on international topics.
Okay.
We have people every year that come in and get really competitive about trying to win. fun. We're hosting again with Roswell Park at their property. It's this Thursday from 5 to 8 p.m. and there's still time if you want to buy a table and come and join us.
Okay, we can challenge some people. Should we give a sample of what some of this mind-boggling trivia might be like?
Sure, I'm happy to pop quiz you if you want to.
Okay, I'll sit on the hot seat here.
Okay, all right. So it'll be questions like this. All right, they're themed.
This is probably one of the really hard ones.
We're going to give you a hard one for sure. All right, so pack your red clothes. La Tomatilla Festival is one of the largest annual food fights in the world. The event occurs annually in August when hundreds of people hurl ripe tomatoes at each other for 1 hour. La Tomatilla has attracted tourists from all over the world to take part in this event. So where in the world does this take place? I'm going to give you multiple choice here.
Thank you.
A, Valencia, Spain. B, Sutamarchan, Colombia. C, Buenos Aires, Argentina. D, Sevilla, Spain.
Oh, wow. I'm going to have to go with Argentina.
Wrong.
No.
Valencia.
Oh, my
Spain.
goodness.
Wrong country, too.
Wrong country, wrong hemisphere. Well, I guess I can't participate then, but maybe we can find some other teams. If people wanted more information, best way?
Go to our website, www.iibuffalo.org. You can form a team of 4 to 6 people. It begins at 5:30 on Thursday. You can get there around 5 o'clock. There's some food. There are prizes. It's a great event to bring coworkers to. Have a good night. So Gabe
DeMeo is the moderator.
Yes, the famed Gabe DeMeo of local radio history, as well as our director of communications is the MC. He'll be calling the shots. So it's a fun event, and it's sort of a mid-year fundraiser for us. So we love the support if people want to come.
And on the scale of game show hosts, does he rank more like a Bob Barker or let's say like Ken Jennings? Where does he fall in there?
I think more Bob Barker.
Very nice. Yes. Thank you so very much. All right. Well, thank you for the moment of levity, and hopefully that intrigued a few people who were listening to this program and taking in a lot of the issues. There's a lot here to talk about. Green cards. This is an issue that you also brought to my attention as well. What is happening with green cards right now?
So we are concerned that there have been reports that U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is the immigration entity that handles all benefits, that they have put a suspension in place for the processing of green cards of individuals who are refugees and asylees, people granted asylum. The pause is due to security checks or doing an additional security review. What I would say to that is that refugees and asylees are very vetted populations. They've gone through lots of security clearances and waiting for many years and in court processes, in fact, to be able to get that status. So it used to be in the past that getting the green card after 1 year here was more of a formality, legitimizing what had already been granted. It's different from if you were to marry, let's say, a foreigner and want to sponsor them on a fiance visa or a marriage visa to come here. That person for the first time gets vetted through their green card process. But refugees and asylees already went through a lot of vetting. So we just stand here in the resettlement community concerned because a green card is the next step on the pathway to citizenship. And we want to make sure that people are able to pursue that and achieve that and have continued assurances of their permanency and their humanitarian grant and protections here. So just hoping that this pause is not long and that it resumes, that they can continue processing.
What have we heard so far in terms of, deportation was a big campaign promise by the man who won the presidency. What have we heard so far about deportation? There's been a lot of high publicity, the El Salvador situation, the one that stands out. What have we heard?
So there have definitely been ICE pickups here of immigrants, but there haven't been raids yet in large scale here.
Okay.
It seemed like the emphasis, at least from the national news that I followed, was more on some of the bigger cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, et cetera. We have not had large raids here, and I hope that we don't, because it would definitely strike fear in the hearts of people. The news coverage of deportation and the announcements coming out from the administration, though, have definitely struck enough fear that we see people not showing up to work or just disappearing from work, kids not going to school, parents holding them back. And that's just a concern overall because, if people become more closed in, then they are unlikely to seek services or help if they need it. For instance, if they become the victim of a crime, they're going to be worried about asking the police for help or reporting it. We've heard people saying that even if they're sick, they're unwilling to go to the hospital because they're afraid that ICE will be called to pick them up there. So, the messaging about you're going to be deported, even though it hasn't happened in huge numbers and in a large scale, has definitely still had a chilling impact on the population that's very worried about being deported, and people are staying home.
What about advice? And maybe you're not in a position because it's such a, everything's so up in the air, it seems, in a way. But, we talked about this at the beginning of the program about, the way the community came forward with the emergency fund to help fund resettlement agencies here and try to work through these very difficult times with the federal government suspending their funding. What about, so we know that there are lots of people here who, for lack of, we can use the word sympathetic, but just believe that helping their neighbor, whether or not that neighbor was born in the United States or came here as a refugee or whatever the case may be, they want to be someone who's going to help their neighbor. Now we're in a position here where maybe helping your neighbor might, who knows what could happen to you if that neighbor happens to be somebody who is not born in the United States, that doesn't have a legitimate status, or just a status that might get kind of swept up, as we saw with this man from Maryland who's in El Salvador. What about advice from you to people who want to help?
So what you've described is what I think is the generosity of the human spirit. And that has come up against what some in legal circles call aiding and abetting, and a concern that this administration may look more seriously at someone who, in trying to help somebody who is out of status, may end up finding themselves charged with aiding and abetting or potentially interfering with an ICE pickup. And so when we've talked to people or when people have called, whether it's churches,
and you're getting a lot of calls like that? Yep.
We have, yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, the advice is to not interfere with government processes because you don't want to end up arrested yourself. And we're still watching and waiting to see how the government will characterize aiding and abetting. I mean, is a food pantry at a church giving out food to someone who shows up and says they're hungry, is that aiding and abetting? They're not asking questions about the person's immigration status or not, but does that come down to aiding and abetting? I hope that we don't get to that space because that is concerning. Everyone wants to be able to make sure no one, goes into extreme distress and harm right in front of them. But those things are being fleshed out. And that's why I would just route us back to the law. We have a good system in place of judicial review. It needs to be used. Everyone should have their day in court. Everyone who is under, accusation of something should have the ability to defend themselves. There shouldn't be a government that's just summarily making a decision and effectuating it without giving people a chance to review it and having an outside impartial party like a judge review the process. And so I hope that we stay in a place that judicial review is still a core tenet of our legal system and that we do not see an erosion of rights. And that is, I remain watching and waiting and reading the newspaper while these things play out.
Yeah, I was going to ask about what you're going to be watching and waiting for in the coming months, but I just also want to make sure that we note, because we haven't, that you've had to lay off employees and other members of the resettlement community here in Western New York, other agencies, they've also laid people off as well.
Yeah, it's been a tough go for us since January. The Institute has, we laid off 10 people. We didn't fill some positions, so we're operating about 15 headcounts down at this point. The other agencies have also had to do layoffs, so I would say easily roughly 80 to 90 positions that were in the refugee resettlement community in our in Western New York no longer exist due to federal funding cuts. And there's a great fear that that will continue as we move forward into the fiscal year and we look at the new budget process when it starts in September, that other federal funding that comes through programs like Health and Human Services, that may be cut as well. That is why we have been really pushing to our elected leaders, our state delegation to support us through New York State funding.
There is New York State funding
There is. Thankfully, it was created during the first Trump administration to support the resettlement agencies that almost had to close their doors last time due to the suspension and federal resettlement. That funding line is called NYSERP, New York State Enhanced Services for Refugees program. And it quite frankly kept the lights on during the first Trump administration. And we've had that as a steady funding line ever since. And we're hoping that this year it stays level or hopefully goes up in order for us to continue to provide services. I mean, just because there's no new refugees arriving due to federal changes doesn't mean that there aren't people here to serve. I mean, there are people who are still recently arrived. There are people who are far less than their 5 years here before citizenship. We want to make sure all that those people are employed and, have doctors and are, going through the process to get their kids in school and contributing to our economy, right? And successfully integrating. And so that's what that funding pays for. We're grateful to have it. A lot of other states do not have it. And we have already seen resettlement agencies close their doors across the country just because they couldn't afford to stay open, post January 20th when all that funding got abruptly cut.
Jennifer Rizzo-Choi is the Executive Director of the International Institute of Buffalo. We are out of time. I appreciate you coming in and taking us through these many issues as you do so very well. And best of luck to you and your agency and all the many people you serve here in Western New York. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having us and for talking through these issues. And if you care about this topic at all, please do call your elected leaders and let them know to support us and to resume refugee resettlement.
You have been listening to What's Next on Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.